Welcome to episode 11 of the End of Seeking podcast. We skipped a week because of Imogen's 10-day retreat, which has just finished a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
How was that for you?
Really strong, actually. Really beautiful. It's the first time I've done 10 days, and I think there's a lot to recommend it, actually, in many ways. Although I think my body was ready for a bit more sort of movement in it. Sitting in a chair for 6+ hours a day can be quite full on. But actually was sort of like, I wish I could, do this for longer.
Right.
There's something about the continuity, and it was a slightly smaller group, and there's something about the continuity of meeting the same people day in, day out, multiple times a day, and particularly the satsangs every day, sort of building on each other and really allowing us to uncover and deepen into topics, which I thought was really lovely. It's like somehow people getting into that, it takes people quite a few days to get into their stride of that kind of type of engagement.
Yeah. Any themes emerge in the satsang or the experiences?
The one thing that I really, so there's a few themes, but it's funny. I was in bed very early this morning, and some writing came out, and I wrote on my phone. I sort of typed very arduously on my phone.
You need a swipe keyboard. I love a swipe keyboard. I haven't tapped in years.
I can't. It doesn't. Yeah.
Anyway,
not happening. This recognition that all suffering comes down to one thing, pretty much.
Go on.
And that is
I'm at the edge of my chair here.
Say again?
I'm at the edge of my chair here. You got the answer.
No. I'm not saying I have any answers. I'm just saying it's an observation of an issue, of a point of suffering.
Right.
And a root cause of suffering. The root cause of suffering, maybe not in its entirety, but you can pretty much dig deep enough into what is coming up for people, and it stems from the belief in the separate I thought.
Right.
So yeah, sort of whether it's overtly that.
Well, we were talking about it in the car the other day, weren't we? And that this had come up. And, my experience with working with people and my own experience in myself as well. So these are one and the same thing, that there's so many apparent problems that seem to demand to be solved. Yeah. Personal problems. Yeah. Problems that pertain to the person. But if you...
And they seem very, very urgently in necessity of action and solving.
Yeah, exactly. And but if you engage in the inquiry effectively, if you explore the veracity of the problems as they're arising, and then you go right down to, as you say, layer upon layer, and see what's underlying them all. This common thread, which is the actual belief in that you are a person, the belief that you are.
And there's all sorts that come out of that. For instance, things like, which was another thing that was talked about a lot in the retreat, this idea of non-doership, and trying. You can see through that, see through the doing. There's no doer, but if you miss that, actually, what you're really pointing to is there's no person. Yeah, there's no I. There is a thought that says I and I am doing.
But of course, so this is where this analysis can go awry for people. This sounds like a negation. No. Right? It sounds like, there's no I, there's no person, there's no ego, there's no self. And of course, on its own terms, you go, well, that's nonsense, because obviously I exist. Or fear that by denying, deconstructing the notion of the personal self, you're left with nothing. But that's not the answer. The answer actually is the discovery that the I, as Ramana would put it, the self of the self, that it's not that we don't exist, it's what we exist as.
Yeah.
And so it's discovering the
deeper ground.
The deeper ground, being consciousness.
Yeah.
So, which holds the arising of the apparent personal self.
Exactly.
So you have to discover the deeper ground in order for that deconstructing analysis of there is no I, there is no personal self, that for that to be safe. We talked about last time, really safe versus unsafe. Find the deeper ground.
Find the deeper ground.
And then from that perspective, you, in one stroke, see that there is no, permanent personal self.
Exactly. And from that perspective, the then more human work, let's call it, is then included and held and met.
Yeah.
But otherwise, if you're staying on the surface of the psychological, physical sort of temporary arising human experience of life, and taking that to be you only, that work is endless.
So
that can get very disheartening and overwhelming, actually. A sense of overwhelming. And, this was also something that was coming up in discussion.
Right.
So for me, it always comes back down to discover your true nature, to discover the deeper ground, to discover that which is ubiquitously known as self, but not the misidentification of the temporary arising small self that we would call the ego.
Yeah.
So it's vital, and it's sort of it's that first principle of seek the highest first.
Yeah. Know that, by knowing which all becomes known.
Yeah.
Which is the light of consciousness, which is self.
Yeah. And so it's like, for me, going on these retreats is, we're coming at that in so many different ways because everyone has their own experience, obviously. And so you're sort of meeting that in many different avenues. But it is fundamentally all comes back down to that. And so I was reflecting on this as like, and I think you and I have talked about this many times.
Many times, yeah.
Of just feeling a little bit like a broken record sometimes. And there's a constant, there's always a bedrock you get to in these discussions, it's not just discussions, it's in these inquiries, in these views of life. And so you could say, oh God, we're just, sort of saying the same thing. And it's like, but no, there's infinite ways in which life is experienced, and therefore infinite ways in which the formless turns into form and form turns back into formless. And there's infinite ways in which that is experienced.
But liberation is so simple, and I mean that. I'm not saying it's easy.
This definitely came up in the retreat. Right. Those exact words, in fact, I think it was.
Right, but it's so simple. It's so simple. It's overlooked.
Yeah.
And life can get very complex very quickly, but most of those problems and issues pertain actually to a delusion, to a false view.
Yeah.
That begs to be explored and recognized.
Yeah. And so in many ways, each of those problems is, quotes problems, let's say, is an opportunity to come to clearer view of the truth of the moment.
Yeah. It's funny. I was just looking. I don't know where it came up, but there was a book that was written. It's a slight pivot, not much, but a little bit. And there was a book that was written by a Google head engineer a few years ago now, and I think something like. I mean, he was a really smart guy. I think he's Indian, and I think his son died. His adult son or something died in a tragedy, and he went into a sort of a condition of quite deep, deep grief, obviously from that experience. But in the wake of it, literally within a week or two of that, he started to go, I have to get to the bottom of this happiness problem. And as a algorithmic engineer or something, he wrote a book. In the end, he analyzed in his way human experience. I laugh because it's sort of quite it's a very technical approach, scientific approach to the problem of human happiness. And he wrote a book in the end called Solve for Happy. Very very algorithmic approach to happiness, but it's actually very interesting. And I haven't read the book entirely. I've seen him interviewed a few years ago, but the book title kind of came in front of me yesterday, and I went, oh yeah, I forgot about that guy, and that notion. And the idea is he reduced the problem of human happiness to an algorithm. And the algorithm is happiness equals reality minus expectations.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one of the quotes I've written time and time again is suffering equals expectations, which is effectively what is.
So if your expectations of reality exceed what reality is presenting to you, or that odds with it, then you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
But if you, let's say, lower your bar or adjust your expectations so that life is presenting more than you expect. But I go further. Yeah. Don't get me wrong.
Okay.
I go further, and this is what was interesting. That as an algorithm, there's a few interesting things in there. One of them is that his recognition that happiness is our actual baseline.
Yes.
Right?
Agreed.
It's only when we adopt expectations that are out of accord with what reality is delivering that we start to suffer.
Yeah, the way I've described this is you've got on one side of the equation, one side of the, Formula. No. I'm trying to say something else here. Okay. One side of, I don't know how to describe this over audio. I've got my left hand. So
okay. On one side
you have reality, what is.
Yes.
And on the other side, your left hand, your right hand. God, I'm dyslexic, so it's not going well so far. But on your right hand, you have your expectations of what should be.
Yeah.
And the bigger the gap between the left and the right hand the larger amount of suffering.
Indeed.
So this is sort of how I view it, is like when there is no gap, as in they are in union, the left and the right hand are in union, you have the reality of what is and the expectations, they are aligned, they are the same, they are one and the same. There is no suffering there.
Yeah.
So it's only when we have this gulf or this gap between what is and what we want to be, where there's suffering. And it's like you have to choose one. Where's your loyalty going to be? Your loyalty going to be to your expectations of what should be or what is?
Now, of course, I was sort of thinking about it a little bit and realizing there are other species of expectations, and there are things like entitlements, which is entitlements equals expectations plus arrogance, something like that. Because it's like, I'm entitled to this. The reality owes me.
Yeah.
And it relates to the Buddhist notion of one of the proximal causes of suffering. So they figured it out, yes, which what they call tanha, which means craving or thirsting. It's like, it's not just desire in the usual sense. Oh, I'd love that, great, whatever, but I have to.
Yeah, it's the attachments.
You're like
desire.
making sort of demands upon reality to deliver what you want, and that's a form of suffering.
Yeah.
So there's entitlement, there's the kind of thirsting and the craving of tanha, as well as expectations. But again, what it seems to point to is this: that we have an idea, we can adopt an idea about how reality should be.
Yeah.
And then we orient to that rather than to
truth,
what
rather
reality,
than reality is.
Yeah, what is arising. Yeah. And the whole thing can actually be thrown away. Expectations just.
Well, as soon as they're seen as such, that's an expectation.
Yeah.
That's a belief of how it should be.
Yeah.
When that becomes clear, and we don't necessarily choose to have those things become clear, but we can be awake to the fact that is a possibility, and that possibility often causes suffering, or almost always causes suffering.
But of course, expectations are, most of them, or many of them, are rooted in false ideas about the nature of reality.
Yes.
And this is why I really always liked the some of the Buddhist formulations, identifying the nature of this conditioned relative realm. One, and there was three. What was it? The three marks of existence, which is anicca, anatta, and dukkha. Anicca is impermanence. It's there's no permanence. It's a constant flux of relative phenomena. There's no fixed points. Anatta isn't. There's no personal self in here. You couldn't, because it's impermanent. You can't find anywhere where you could plant your flag of that personal identity.
Yeah. So this is me.
Yes.
Roll out the carpet. Yeah. Here's the object of me.
Right here, because it's moving. It's flux. And dukkha, which is the other one, which is sort of unsatisfactory. It's incapable of satisfying. But those are basically observations of the nature of reality. And for me, one sort of leads from another. And the important one there for me is the impermanence. That if you really get to the bottom of impermanence, if you really grok the fundamental temporary, changing, flux nature, then there's nowhere left. There's nowhere to plant the flag of personal identity.
Is there, so
and there's nowhere that can permanently satisfy, because the nature is impermanence.
But so obviously
we're talking about conditioned existence.
Yes,
here,
so that's
not absolute.
Yes, so that was my question, because I don't come from the Buddhist sort of perspective. I was asking, does that mean there is? Because from my perspective, there is a ground of permanence.
Well, no.
So that's what I wanted to clarify. What you meant there.
Yeah, and that's important to note. I mean, it's similar. It's the same as saying absolute and relative. It's the unconditioned, let's say, which is the ground.
So you're just talking about the relative or the conditioned.
It's not the three marks of existence, it's the three marks of conditioned existence.
I see.
It's the relative aspect. Right. And so if someone's only aware and only, cognizant of the relative field of life, of the conditioned field of life, and is trying to find permanence in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why you can't...
A permanent identity, permanent existence.
On that level... That's why the ego is looking for safety, because it actually fundamentally, safety cannot be found on that level.
Yeah.
And that's why there is a constant search for safety. But the problem is, it has to be transcended to find the solution, the quote solution of that, which is you cannot find safety or permanence in the relative. You have to transcend it and find the safety and permanence of consciousness itself.
Yeah, the ground of being from which the conditioned existence stirs and appears. So, again,
but it's not a solid safety. It's not the safety of the relative.
Well, it's a different. No, it's not an objective.
Yeah, that's
safety.
what I mean. A material. When I say solid, that's what I meant. Yeah.
But the discovery of the ground is the discovery of boundless, timeless, ever present formlessness.
Never not.
And the security in that. The relief of your own sense of permanence as being itself.
And there's no conditions to that, and there's there's almost no qualities, relative qualities of that, actually, in terms of I am this, I am that, this is that. It's not.
As the witness, as the awareness witness. Yes, it's in that nominal duality. It's attributeless.
Yeah.
But it's the source of all attributes. That's the thing.
Exactly.
You have to include, and how it shows itself is through them. And its nature is through them, through its own manifestations. Our own manifestations. That's it. So that impermanence is important to go. Oh, stop looking there. You're not going to find it there.
Yeah.
Find the source of it all.
Yeah, it comes back to sort of when you speak about the source of it all. It's like when there's a thought that says I, but without that thought, which is an impermanent thought.
Yeah.
There's just existence.
Yes, exactly.
There's just existence, the felt sense of existence, the knowingness of existence, without any thought of what or how or who or any of these considerations. It's just that recognition of existence is.
I am.
Yeah.
But the I is
a different kind of I. And this is where it gets tricky because we use the same word there. In the English language.
Yeah,
anyway.
And that's why it's important to make distinctions. When you say I don't exist, well, that's a
what are you referring
that's
to?
almost a silly thing to say, because if you say I don't exist, well, the I that you think you are doesn't exist, but the self is all there is.
Yeah. So easy to get so confused when you're trying to understand this from a mind perspective, and it's only through direct experiential knowingness that you finally, all the pieces of the puzzle come into play, and you go, oh, that was what was being spoken of. That's what that riddle of I don't exist meant and means. And I think it just comes back again and again to, you can have all the knowledge in the world. You can try to understand this as much as possible in the mind, but it's only through the direct tasting of your essential primordial nature that gives a true perspective to what we're speaking about here, I feel.
And it all, sort of wheeling back to where we started, it was this idea that so many of the problems that the person perceives and conceives of and has to deal with, and all pertain to the existence of a vulnerable, temporary person construct that's desperate, trying to shore up its own existence.
I was about to that was the exact phrase that came to me as well. Well, actually, shore up its boundaries, shore up its
Exactly. Constantly trying to make something permanent out of, a bunch of something impermanent out of a range of impermanent, objects. And so when the ground of consciousness being is recognized, when the identity falls like through the bottom of the person and into the ground of being itself, the I amness, not the person, when that formless boundless consciousness is recognized as the seat of your own actual existence,
yeah,
then the problems of the person kind of, I would say, I'm not saying the person doesn't continue to have problems or things that need to be dealt with. And situations.
Let's call them
that
situations.
arise. Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't say they become problems. For instance,
but the problem of self-identity is gone.
Yeah, for instance, there's a fire in the corner. It's not a problem. It's a situation that needs dealing with. I mean, that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
But the problem is always in reference to the person.
Well, this is it. The problems that we suffer are mostly the problems of self-identity, really, in some sense. And
yeah, I should be this. I shouldn't be that.
That's where we're at. We're talking. I mean, you could take it down to a more mundane level, and maybe different levels of analysis are appropriate for it. But we're in this domain. What we're talking about is the essence of who am I. What am I? What is the nature of this reality that seems to present itself?
Yeah.
So you were on your retreat that the I thought was being contended with?
Either overtly or, the discussion was maybe not obviously around that always.
Well, it's not always grok that's the problem, is it?
No, but that's to me is where it always comes down to.
Yeah.
That was one stroke of it, I would say. And then the other stroke of it was inevitably when you're sitting for many hours in silent meditation or transmissions, as the case may be in this instance, it's like when the attention is turned to the ground of awareness, it's like all that arises within that awareness becomes then very obvious. It's like getting all the junk out of the kitchen cabinets that's hidden in the kitchen cabinets for all of eternity. So you're sort of bringing all this stuff, or rather all this stuff is coming up into the light of awareness. And so inevitably strong emotions and experiences, sensations, thoughts start to arise to the surface. And so then the other stroke of the retreat very much was sort of very practically how to meet all of that. And I think for me, it always starts from what we're just talking about. It starts from establishing the ground, establishing the unending, boundless awareness that holds all of this, and not holds in terms of and not holds in terms of attention of grasping, but holds in terms of akin to like a fruit bowl holding all the fruit.
Nice.
It's so there is room for all of this. It's only when we recognize the ground that we can see that actually, yes, this too is welcome. Even this thought that says, oh God, I can't deal with this. Oh, I'm overwhelmed by this sensation and this feeling. And so once that ground is established, it's like the work of meeting what is present without judgment, without trying to fix, trying to change, trying to get rid of, and instead with a very tender curiosity. And God, the alchemy that happens when you do that, when you and sometimes we need to be guided if that's sort of an alien concept of what that actually looks like. But once you grok what is being done there, it's like I say, the alchemy of it, the transformation that is found. When you meet, say, a contraction, that you feel a pain in the heart, and you meet that with tenderness and curiosity,
instead of resistance or avoidance or suppression. So you're able to move into it. It's not a push. It's like being guided with that curiosity and that tenderness. You're guided into what feels like the darkness, but it's like it's bringing the light into all of that. It's to light up. It's to become aware of, to
bring awareness to that which has been previously unseen and unmet, and in the shadows of life.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to, and then, so let me finish my train of thought there. It's like, and then it opens up to the next underlying layer, and then that opens up, and then that opens up, and then that opens up. It's almost like you're traversing through all the silt layers of existence, but you're not pushing through them, which creates a lot of resistance. You're in meeting with curiosity and tenderness. You're sort of being guided through all these layers. It's like a pebble dropping into the lake, and it's a really beautiful process to watch, to witness, to be a part of.
This is sort of, it's sort of shadow work in a sense, isn't it? Conscious inquiry like this is a form of shadow work in that you're wandering down with a torch.
Yeah.
And, in our lives where so much of our experiences have been put into shadow for various reasons, instinctively and, reflexively. Yeah. And then we avoid them because they're there in shadow, and
because they're not allowed to be.
They're not allowed to be.
That's
integrated.
Yeah, and the not allowed to be comes from the misunderstanding of our nature. Yeah. When you understand your nature, that actually can and does include all aspects, positive, negative, doesn't matter. Yeah. All is included. But if you're still viewing yourself as the impermanent body mind. Yeah. There's plenty of stuff on that level, on the conditioned level of life, the relative level of life. There's plenty of stuff that seemingly can't be.
And, it ultimately, we all have it. We all have these shadows and these unlit, denied aspects of our experiencing. And our psychology and our emotional life and all this stuff.
And our bodily sensation experience, all of it.
And, the strategy of shadowing, let's say, is imperfect because we might turn our attention away from it, hide it habitually to the extent that we deny or even are not aware that these aspects even exist.
Yep.
But they do, and they affect us.
They do.
What did Jung say? Something like, the shadow that we don't deal with in ourselves manifests in our lives.
Yeah.
So where did that come from?
Yeah.
Why am I reacting like that?
And it may have no seeming relevance to the initial sort of suppression of some experience, right. But it is seen in our reactions to life. We turn up, we have a interaction with someone, and there's a real reactivity there.
Yeah.
And it's because some part of our experience we don't want to meet.
Yeah.
And maybe they are expressing that some part of experience that we can't own and be with in ourselves.
And I'd say that this experience happens before and after awakening. That's been my experience.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, my water bottle just made
slurping.
A very strange noise.
That there's these pockets of unlit regions of being. They aren't always obvious. Some people have different view on this. Some say go looking for them. I think it's fine to a certain extent, but at the same time, I trust that the natural evolution and growth of our own being ultimately brings it all up. I know some disagree with that view. Some spiritual teachers disagree with that view. You have to go, but I think that can be. Well, I was thinking about that the other day. That it's tricky it's almost easier to go looking for it when you still believe in yourself as a person. When you wake up to non-duality and you recognize the impersonal nature of your being, it's impossible to strategize or to employ methods and techniques in order to uproot these things unless they actually naturally occur as a function of being.
That's why I was talking about with that natural curiosity and openness. It's like being guided into these depths. It's not a push. The person will see a push and will see a technique of, I need to do this, then I need to do that, then I got to do this, and there's the going looking for it.
Yeah.
But to me, it's like when there is this natural curiosity, again, that makes it sound like I need to be curious, but just noticing that actually naturally there is a curiosity that is there of life, that life is like constantly opening up to the next moment, and that wonderment of the next, rather than a resistance of, oh, I'm scared of what's next, you know. So when there's that there, that's what I'm talking about, that natural pull into the depths. Yeah. You don't have to go looking for it. You just need to be present to that which stops, you know, i.e. the personal resistance.
Right. Right.
That sort of hits into fear of the unknown, hits into the fear of the darkness or the shadow or the depths. That's mostly what you need to, I think, most people need to be aware of in this kind of work, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
To how to meet resistance, and resistance itself is often what we must meet first and foremost.
Yeah. So I'm just going to pick up a little bit on the thread that something that can be tricky on the path and beyond. And one of the consequences of non-dual awakening, liberation, is this shift from being at least conceived of, but self-conceived as an autonomous individual who can make choices and apply techniques and methods, etc., towards certain ends, to the shift into the recognition, oh, I am consciousness. The body-mind moves as a function of the totality of consciousness and not from its own volition. And Shinzen Young talked about this. He said one of the downsides. He had this little video with some of the downsides of awakening, and one of them was that you can't really make things happen. Things like either occur or they don't.
Yeah.
And I've seen some teachings that from some teachers who, in my view, haven't contended fully with non-doership. Mm-hmm. So to prescribe to someone who is no longer a person as such is futile. And I don't know why. That's a little bit of a bugbear with me.
Well, it all becomes instead of a prescription, as in to prescribe, at that point, to me, the shift becomes to more a description of what's happening, what could happen, a possibility of something that may be noticed.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an interesting thing to me anyway. Where prescription becomes description. But more to the point, practically speaking, where the rubber meets the road, once the non-dual reality is abiding, once you know, recognize and realize your nature as the ground, as consciousness, and that's your, let's say, the seat of identity is no longer falsely in the person, but it's in fact where it belongs, and the truth of it, which is being itself, consciousness itself. Once that's present, and the person is seen as what it is, which is a relative construct.
Yeah. An arising thought believed in.
An arising thought believed in, and, you know, let's say the lens by which, you can argue, the lens by which consciousness manifests and knows its own.
Yeah, absolutely.
Variety of reality.
I don't think there's anything wrong
with
the ego with the I thought. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as the ground of the ubiquitous nature, true nature, is known. It's put any amount of clothing on, you're still the same one that you always were.
Yeah, but even when it isn't, you know, this is it. There's no. It's not like consciousness is broken, and it's presenting, you know, the existence of the person. Let's say and we could call it delusion, because it's not fully true.
Well, it's not the true clarity of.
Let's talk about the person is a belief of the existence of the presence of the belief in personhood manifested in the world. It's delusional. It's not true because the true ground, the true seat of identity has been lost to it. But even this language hints at the fact that it's some kind of error, mistake, even the word delusion.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's not wrong from the viewpoint of consciousness at all.
No, consciousness is expressing in that manner.
Exactly.
And if the viewpoint of I am that consciousness is never lost, nothing is lost by that view, by that temporary arising of the I thought. Nothing can be lost.
Yes. So, but the point I wanted to point to was that what happens to someone when they grok the ground as themselves, as self, and recognize the nature of this whole shebang? Well, they're not doing it anymore.
No.
And you know it. Yeah,
because any sense of doership is born in the impermanence.
Right. And the spontaneous arising of the appearance of person and world. And that's known now for what it is. And you just realize there's no one steering the boat. You know, there's no one. And there
never was. I think that's the big thing I see a lot, is the assumption of, if I'm not in charge, oh God, there's no one's going to be in. You know, there's that fear.
You feel fear of losing control, but the fact
someone else is going to be in charge. If I'm not in control, someone else is going to be in control, or maybe no one's going to be in control, and then it's all going to go to whatever.
Right.
But the true recognition is I never was in control.
No.
So, you know,
no, it was just the illusion of control in the first place. You've not lost nothing except the illusion.
Yeah. So there's nothing to be afraid of.
But of course, part of the challenges of being awake in an unawake world are that 99.99% of the people that you will encounter believe in personal autonomy.
This came up in the retreat, actually, of like one of the course participants had mentioned, and it's beautiful, this analogy of it's almost like you sober up.
Yeah.
And so then I spoke about this idea of, walking into a bar
and everyone's pissed.
and you're drunk, for those who don't know what that means. And
they think you're weird. Yeah. They're like, what's your problem,
exactly.
man?
And trying to convince them that they should not be drunk is an impossibility at that point.
But trying to convince you to be, it's just like an impossibility.
Yeah. And so, and actually, if you've ever spent time around a load of drunk people, there's one of two ways it can go. One, it can be rather unpleasant. There's
no, it's amusing maybe for 5 minutes, but after a while you go, this is dysfunctional. Thank you very much. I've done it.
Anyway, I don't want to suggest there's a
It's a metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're the only sober one in a bar when everyone's drunk, and they think you're the weird one.
Yeah. I think that was the point. Yeah.
Yeah. But
also, whether you could use just a different viewpoint of that, not to do with sober or not, but just to have, sometimes we see life differently when you have a perspective shift, a shift in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
You see life fundamentally different.
Yes.
And that to other people they can make, like, look at you as if you're crazy.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's a very fine line, and I think there is a very fine line between, those in sort of mental health institutes having mental health issues versus having spiritual awakenings.
Yeah.
I think there's probably a grey area there.
Well, and again, right, so, we talk a lot about this and experience, and also what comes to mind is Susan Segal's book, Collision with the Infinite.
Yeah.
When, for those who don't know, it's a great book. I think it's in print now again after many years of not being in print, and it's the account of a woman who spontaneously woke up stepping onto or off a bus, boom, and the form of her awakening was she recognized no self. She recognized, oh, there's no one here. There's no self here. There's no personal self. Yeah. But for some reason, that became a terrifying pathology for her.
Well, in the context of psychology, it is.
No, her immediate response, yeah, sure. She later became trained as a psychologist, and in order to get to the bottom of this, even though the whole while going, there's no one doing this, I don't exist, but my point is she experienced tremendous fear.
Yeah. Well, because there's an expectation, a conditioned view that there should be a self.
Exactly.
And that if there isn't a self, then you have fundamentally broken. Something's wrong with you.
Absolutely.
Mentally, something is wrong with you. And that's what I mean in terms of the psychological point of view. There is something wrong there.
Well,
but in terms of the spiritual point of view, that's entirely correct.
Yeah, I mean, you say psychological, and you're right, but even just from the what do you call it, the consensus reality.
Yeah,
right.
But that psychological view is kind of the consensus reality in many ways.
Right.
That's as far as most of the consensus reality goes.
Well, we presume there's a self. We presume there's an individual self, and that probably comes online what I've read and heard, and is about age 2. You start to. Yeah, I mean,
you can see it. You can see it when you spend time around kids. You can see that sort of
they're
shift.
selfless for a couple of years, and then it becomes they become quite
Yeah.
Start to bolster a personal self, imagine and bolster a personal self. Anyway, but so
and are encouraged to greatly.
Well, because everyone else believes it.
Yeah.
You're conditioned into the ambient reality. So, you talk about the fine line between a functional awakened person and an inhabitant of a mental institution. There is a fine line there.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is socially constructed, to use
if you have the context to what is happening to you in spiritual terms, and are supported in that dropping away of the self view,
personal self,
that leads to an integrated awakening, I believe. Whereas, and I've met with people, I've had people who've come and had sessions with me, or just even friends, that hasn't been their story. Their story has been unsupported in terms of the spiritual view. Yeah. They've been off on their own. They've been in, just ordinary life with parents and friends and all of that have no spiritual context, and they have
Well, I know of several people
too.
who have been
Yeah.
either institutionalized and or drugged. Psychopharmacopoeia.
It's been pathologized.
Yeah, exactly.
And that has brought a lot of fear in their system to that experience then, because they don't have that context. And so, I mean, that's why, you know, as much as I have a sort of love-hate relationship, I have an ambivalent relationship with organizations, these larger spiritual, religious type organizations and teachings. I do have a ambivalent relationship there.
Me too.
Because of my own experiences.
But it can provide a supportive and like affirming context for people to sort of understand.
Yeah, context is king. To be able to have that context to what is going on with you. Because especially it makes all the difference,
right? Because sometimes, you know, we've talked about this, that often, in fact, spiritual awakening can be a deeply disruptive and destructive
it's a messy
thing.
Business. Not always, but mostly.
Not always, but often, because the structures that support the ego aren't necessarily the same structures that support the coming into one's own, you know, spiritual reality.
And I think having the right kind of support makes it less messy. It doesn't make it not messy, but it makes it's held. It's like the context and the support of, you know, like having someone to support and guide you through that, or a group or whatever it is. What can be there then is trust in this process. There's a welcoming or a lack of resistance to the process as you find it. When there is no context or no support, no group, no teacher, no teaching.
In fact, it's aggressively against it. I mean, as you said, you know, in the world of the Susan Siegel, you know, awoke to, and then started to study psychology to get to the bottom of this, because she was, you know, lived with like pure fear in her system for like about 10 years before she started to gain a better insight into what was happening. But you know, she was constantly confirmed as pathological for all that time. And even though what she was reporting was experientially and evidentially real and true for her and all of us, that there's no personal self as a distinct entity. So you're lucky. Let's face it. If you're lucky, if you let's say approach awakening and come to awakening in a supportive place. But I think there are plenty who have messy awakenings and you know, problematic and aggressive judgments from others in their community.
But you can even have that happen even in a spiritual community, though.
Indeed.
I mean, you can. It's not, and that's why I say the right kind of thing. And I'm not saying that there is a right one size fits all for everyone.
And because it's your karma, actually, as well. You can be
having those types of unfolding awakenings within the context of a spiritual community that actually isn't supportive of what you are going through. And that can be really devastating.
So it brings me to a little thing came up this week, and I even wanted to talk about here, and it was another Buddhist thing. I mean, I love Buddhism. It's such a old and rich and varied tradition. I don't think of myself as a Buddhist. Don't think of myself as anything in particular, but it's definitely
an influence,
an influence, an important tradition. But what I love, there's one thing that came up. I talked about 3 marks of existence, but what came up the other day was remembering the 3 jewels. And I don't know if it was Buddha himself that came up with it, but the formulation of, if you're spiritually inclined, if you want liberation, awakening, however whether you fall into it or you're intentionally, you know, aiming for it, what are the principles that you can take refuge in? And it was said, take refuge in the three jewels. And the three jewels are Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And I thought it was really beautiful because even outside of Buddhism, let's say, if you apply this as a principle in general, as we do nowadays, I mean, it's a buffet of spiritual spiritual teachings and whatnot. But I liked the principles that pointed to. And the way I see them is that, okay, so what do you take refuge in? The three jewels. So what are the three jewels? Well, the first is the Buddha. And what that means I'm not talking about the Buddha himself, although some might. But you're talking about take refuge in the embodiment itself. The either a teacher who is awake and therefore embodies the reality, the truth.
Is the living truth of what is being spoken of.
No, there's issues around, gurudom and all that. And I don't want to get into but in principle, that the highest, in a sense, you can turn to as a seeker is someone who's gone there before and is embodying that
which they speak of.
That which they speak of.
That which you are seeking yourself.
So that's the first. But it's also take refuge in the Buddha in your own heart.
Yeah, because ultimately they are a mirror or a outward manifestation of an inner truth or recognition within oneself.
Because Buddha just means awakened one. Buddho is the awakened light in our own heart. So Buddha, that's the most important, which is to say the living experience and embodiment of
the model of that.
The model of that. But the living reality of that. And then the teachings, the Dharma, that's, take refuge in that also. The teachings are important. The teachings that point you back to that true nature.
Yeah.
Finding those and following those, allowing them to guide you back to your own Buddha nature.
Yeah.
So Buddha, Dharma. And the third... Okay.
Oh, wait, before you move on to the third one. And the teachings, for me, what is critical and something I try and really emphasize again and again, because I think it's really important, is to not take the teachings as knowledge on face value, but take them as a jumping off point to look into your own experience. And when teachings are, rather than written in stone, but as a pointer to the moon, a pointer to discover what they are pointing to.
Yeah, are you just adding information, or or the teachings actually pointing you back to your true nature?
Exactly. Are they a jumping off point of inquiry into your own nature?
Yeah.
At that point, they become invaluable. Yeah. If they are just about learning more knowledge, then they're useless, actually.
So the true Dharma, in terms of teaching, is that which points you back to your true nature.
Exactly.
Right.
Which is the same as the first one.
Which is the Buddha. Which is the Buddha.
Yeah.
And the third is Sangha, and this, what we were just talking about, that being around who you're surrounding yourself by, and where's their head. Because honestly, and I get this a lot. When I'm working with people, and I find a lot of aloneness among people sometimes who I meet with.
Yeah.
They've come into some awakening. It's been really profound for them. They might, whatever stage they're at there, but their old life has sort of fallen away.
Yeah.
And what I mean is, maybe they can't hold down a job anymore. They don't enjoy the things that they used to enjoy, the pleasures that they used to have.
Because they're not orientated around the thing that they once were orientated, which is the ego self.
Right. And also, people will fall away, relationships will fall away.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of aloneness in that, because if they're not within a spiritual context, as we talked about,
a
true. Yeah. Or I'm talking, these are ideals here. Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. I'm talking about the ideals of these. I'm not talking about the
corruption
obvious
of them.
the pitfalls that come when these are sort of imperfectly manifested. But there's that aloneness, and if you haven't got, if you're not part of a spiritual tradition or have spiritual friends, or yeah. And I don't mean this in some general spiritual thing, but I mean that are on the same page as you,
Yeah.
that are on the same level of you, or at least in a mix where they're at least somewhat earnestly seeking the highest. There's so much value in that, and I see so much aloneness, but I see particularly in the West now, there's a real shortage of true spiritual contexts and sangha.
I think there's a shortage of community, actually, generally speaking.
Well, sangha is community.
No, but I mean, just take away the word spiritual even in there, and just, I think that we're going through a crisis of community. Generally, I think we're going through a very individual sort of era.
It's the atomization of the individual too.
I think people are losing community and the support of extended families, extended community. I think we're that. So this is just another sort of indicator of that, where the spiritual communities are harder to come by, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing I've been really grateful for in this whole process, this whole life, is, that I've had you. I mean, we've lived in other communities as well. We've lived in a number of spiritual communities at this point. Now we're not, as it happens, but...
Thank God we got each other.
Well, this is what I was going to say, is it's like, and beyond the things of marriage, but just actually to have a friend, to have a buddy, to have someone that you can talk with and explore with and share with, and you, even when your perspectives might be slightly different, the openness and willingness to sort of investigate in a real genuine way is invaluable. I'm really grateful for it, and particularly I think back to those early days for me, after I'd had that massive shift. I had you.
Yeah.
At that point, life had pretty much taken away everything else.
Yeah.
We just left Muji's.
Yeah.
We were alone in the little cottage in the middle of Wales with pretty much no one else around at that point. And for the subsequent months, life again sort of stripped us of all roots and all real sense of community. And
rootless.
And to be able to have you was really supportive because for the time I was going through, even though I was going through quite a difficult time. And I think had we been rooted more in a supportive spiritual community, I probably would have had an easier time of what I was going through, somewhat.
Well, but here's the thing, though.
But I'm glad I had you.
Yes, and likewise. We were... When I had my big awakening, I was in a spiritual community, and immediately I had to get out.
Well, that's what I mean about you can be in a spiritual community and it not be the right spiritual community, and not be actually supportive.
It's very tricky to get to a point where, so if you're surrounded by an R yourself, obviously, I was a spiritual seeker, and all that entails. And in a sangha, so I'm, it's all about appropriateness. It's all about appropriateness and timing.
Of all three of those jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, it's all about appropriateness.
Yeah, because ultimately you transcend them all. So there I was. I had an awakening within a context of a spiritual community. But the nature of the awakening is that I had no part to play there anymore. I had to, when it happened, it wasn't like, part and parcel of what the goal of this community was. It was very clear to me that I couldn't be there. Being surrounded by seekers.
Well,
actually, because don't get me wrong, I was a seeker up until the point it shifted, and then everything changed. All bets were off, and I couldn't play that. It's like I was the sober one in in a bar full of drunks. And it's not. I don't mean to say that. Like,
and everything. But the thing is, everything was orientated around
being a seeker.
Yeah.
And
even though there was a guru, Muji, who was there, his focus was towards seekers.
Yes. No, I mean, my first, having returned to that context after an awakening, a couple of weeks after awakening, and sitting in the same situation that I'd been a couple of weeks before as a seeker, you know, just sponging up all the pointings. It was just so plainly obvious and with such great clarity. That was what I wrote. You know, my silence is more eloquent than the pointings. It was like, I don't need to be pointed to anymore. I don't need the self to be pointed to anymore, even though it was absolutely critical, you know, in the weeks and months and years before. Now it's like, oh, it's obvious. And all I needed to do was get away so I could sit in the silence of my own self, because it was so clear and eloquent.
So that Sangha actually became not supportive for you. And not, you know, not that it wasn't a few weeks before.
No.
But
it's amazing how it shifts and how contextual it is. And
to me, that's an indicator of how, and they can, as these organizations get larger, they get more static and more sort of, what's the word?
Calcified.
Yeah, that's the word, calcified. Around the good of the community rather than the individual.
The awakening of the individual.
And I've seen it, that it's not unique. I've seen it all over. When the focus of the community is more important.
Well, I had a similar experience, you know, in a sense, or not an experience, but an observation of you know, being in the TM movement for so long, and then getting to a point, which I didn't feel seen, recognized, supported, and sort of even allowed to have the insights that
they seem like heresies.
Well, they are. Yeah, exactly.
And actually, they're not.
Yeah,
that's what's crazy. As I look back now, and I'm like, literally, this is what is being taught. How did this turn out to be a heresy? I still to this day, I'm a little bit like, it's all a bit incredulous. It's like, because you've got people who don't see the truth for themselves and are teaching from
their own level.
Yeah. Exactly.
From their own level of consciousness. And that's the trouble. And Ken Wilber talks about this, about cultures, societies, even people having a sort of a center of gravity in terms of levels of consciousness, let's say, or in terms of, you know, for want of a better word. And so so he talks about in terms of culture, but you can talk about, talk about in terms of spiritual communities and organizations and institutions as well. They have their own level. Yeah. And he talks about, Wilbur talks about, if you're at a lower level and you enter into this, say a society's at a certain developmental level in terms of, you know, and you enter into it, you're going to get a free ride up to that level. Mm-hmm. But if you want to go further, it's going to be a struggle. Mm-hmm. And you got to, you know, and that was my experience, you know, it pulls you to a certain level. But the trouble is, if that level isn't like broadly awakened, but, you know, broadly spiritual to a certain sub-non-dual level, that final step past that into non-duality, you're going to have to get the hell out to do it. That was my experience anyway. So, and it was the same with TM, and it was the same with going, you know, sitting with Muji. For all the value of it, somehow I at each point I had to exit. I couldn't go to the next level within the context. I had to step out of the context and go it alone.
Yeah.
And That's a really valuable. I think that's a really valuable lesson. That ultimately you don't let the gravity of the group hold you,
exactly,
and the comfort and the security of that. Don't sell your soul for a spiritual lifestyle.
Yeah,
and it's fine for a while. It is good, and I'm
while
not
it's
knocking
serving,
it.
it's fine.
Served
it's
me
good.
to a point, and then you have to flip out and.
Yeah,
it
and
is supportive.
So this is why for me it's like if I see a teacher or a group or anything like that, or teaching even, that is ultimately trying to bind you to a certain viewpoint, rather than seeing itself as a means to an end, a tool towards liberation, not the liberation in itself.
Well, I think Osho said something. I think it was Osho, and whether he lived this truth or not, was something like, "I'm not here to create devotees. I'm here to create masters."
Exactly.
And yes, whether he lived that reality, I can't, but the idea is that if you genuinely as a teacher, as a guru, I don't like the word guru, but if you're a teacher and you're trying to help guide people into their own awakened sovereignty, you have to give them that sovereignty at every turn, and you have to keep mirroring back. And all these, if someone's offering you tendrils of devotion and stuff, you got to be really. Rupert Spira talked about this. The effective teachers are always mirroring back at any kind of attempt at the student taking hold of the teacher,
which naturally does happen to some extent, because we look up and we see that which we admire and love and are grateful for.
Yes, but the skillful teacher can recognize that, but then say, no, but this is you. This is about you. Exactly. You're the one that's coming to solve it. And
so important.
In effect, you're trying to make yourself redundant.
Exactly.
Like, I'm good when you're ready to fly. You go. And but if that teacher themselves is even subtly interested in some sort of self-serving,
whether they're conscious of it or not,
and it can happen. And I see this, and I also see that a lot of people would say that if a teacher has some self-serving tendencies in there, subtly, they can't be awake. I think that's a misunderstanding of
the different levels and stages of awakening.
Yes, and awakening can be absolutely legitimately there, but there still can be some unresolved human stuff. Yeah. Doesn't mean that they're not existing in the non-dual condition,
and recognize their nature and the nature of life.
Exactly, but
there can still be
some
thin
pockets
veils,
of shadow in there.
Veils or densities or unclarity in there that they can be blind to themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is,
and not to let anyone off any hook here.
No. But because it does have an effect on people around, and so for me, that's why I'm always saying, to stay humble to your own work, to stay humble to the fact that, and I use work very loosely in that term, because again, we were talking about the non-doer of it all. So I'm using it in terms of a description of that unfolding of those shadows and those layers and those veils. I see where there are teachers that are most problematic to me are the ones that really have bought into their own shtick that they're done.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's almost like there's a complacency that sets in. Actually, I was having a really nice conversation with a friend just yesterday about this. Where complacency sort of sets in, a sense of, I'm done. There's nothing. I'm perfect. And while on one level that is entirely true, on the absolute level of consciousness, there's nothing to do. There's no one to do it. There's no work to be done. There's no bad consciousness or good consciousness. It just is what is. Yet on the relative level of form,
life is still working out one's evolution on
and
that,
to be blind
mind
to
body
that
level
is dangerous when you're in the role, when life puts you in that role of teacher, I would say.
It is, and it's really important to, and I think there's an important principle, and it's something like,
not even just the level of teacher. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, I because what I'm going to say is something like the king or the queen or the monarch, the sovereign, has something to bend the knee to, and that is the highest, the transcendent reality. That's why I don't aim, like my path, even though I was exposed to teachers, gurus, and whatnot. By grace, I'm lucky that it went this way. I wasn't looking for the perfect embodiment. I was looking for, I was looking for truth that they represented, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it was the truth I was after, not them.
Well,
as such.
A smart person would recognize that there isn't a perfect embodiment. Embodiment is messy in itself.
Exactly. So I talked about this. Better to, certainly. I mean, God, I'm not ungrateful to the teachers I've had. I'm really
grateful.
Blessed, it was truth.
Yeah.
It was truth, which transcends me and them. It's the truth of self. So don't get caught up in the personality. And I see it happen so much. And the projections of the seeker, oh, my guru's perfect. Oh, and imagine they shit gold or something. It just doesn't, right? It doesn't happen. And that they imagine their perfect family life or their perfect relations.
I've had people
and it just is not true.
Things on me, like the imagination that I don't, ever get upset or don't ever, have any problems or, all of this sort of stuff. And it's like, no. That's the human stuff there.
Yeah, it's always
and there's nothing wrong with the human stuff once you recognize the transcendent reality of your nature.
Yeah.
The human stuff is the expression of life, and it exists in a spectrum of experiencing, from what we would call good all the way down to what we would call bad. And
I would say this though, it's not flat. I would say that true awakening opens one up to the increased expression of love, compassion, the tendency towards kindness. Most awakenings are a really beautiful thing, and it,
But I would say that things like truth, compassion, inclusion, acceptance, forgiveness, all of these descriptions of the fragrance of awakening is the fragrance of our true nature.
Yes.
But what I'm talking about, all of these experiencing can happen within the context of that underlying recognition of the fragrance of love and truth and acceptance and compassion. So there can be sadness and grief and anger and all of this arising within the held ground of love.
Yeah. Yes. So, but don't expect someone, just because they're awake to their true nature, to be personally perfect. And, there
is no such thing.
There is no such thing. No. But as you say, the fragrance of love and peace and acceptance and joy and all these wonderful things,
it
comes exactly because you tap to the source of it.
So that shines through all of the personal experiencing, I would say.
Yeah. Exactly.
That fragrance shines through everything.
Yeah. Because the nature of the self is that, and so it manifests as that through the individual. Yeah. But morality and ethics, those are sometimes they're not as sometimes they are misplaced human constructs, and so to judge too easily. Anyway, I don't know quite where I'm going with this.
Well, I think morality and these kinds of views, these ethics and morality, when rooted from our nature, are descriptions of what that nature, how that nature interacts with life. But when they are disconnected from that nature, then they become laws, then they become something that is constructed, and we should behave like this and we shouldn't behave like that. But the root of them,
there's this
true morality is the self, is love.
Exactly. And I wrote a whole piece on this, and it was about Jesus, I think, but what he sort of represents is this transition from law to spirit. Yeah. So, as long as we're disconnected from the source of our own goodness, we need laws to sort of orient us, or people do, and whatever. And but once one is connected to the source of all goodness in the self, it tends to manifest spontaneously, and the need for the law falls away even as it's fulfilled, because you don't need to tell you do not murder, do not steal, because you're rooted in the ground, which is the ground of goodness, love, truth, reality. Yeah,
and so I want to just maybe investigate into the language there, and it's language I just used as well, but it's something I as you were speaking, I recognize there's an old way of thinking there, maybe, and that's the word connection.
Oh, sure.
And well, no, it's just interesting to me how this sort of this stuff is like there's old habits rooted in there and connection, and it's like, so it's veiled from us, but we're never disconnected from that. Our source. We are our source.
We're never ontologically disconnected,
yes, exactly.
But we can be experientially disconnected, or at least we feel we can be.
Exactly. So I guess I wanted to bring it up to make that point, because I see a lot of people using that language, and we just use that language there, and I want to just bring light to what is meant by that language, because it can create a sense of we are separate objects that are connected.
Yes, not fundamentally unified.
And while on the surface level, two waves may seem like two separate waves, they are always part of the ocean.
Yeah.
So they are never disconnected from the ocean, even though they may be in different parts of the world of the ocean, and so therefore feel entirely disconnected.
Now you've gone off in a digression. You are now responsible for reminding us what we were talking about before you went.
Well,
off
then we're in trouble.
Okay. Anyway, I don't know if that's a reasonable place to stop, but I think let's wrap it up for today.
Yes.
And tune in next week. We won't be skipping another week. We hopefully God willing, we'll be back this time next week with another episode. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, and thank you for your continued support and any sharing if you feel inspired to share, and also comments. We've got an opportunity on our website. You can put questions to us that we might address in the podcast. So if you want to go to endofseeking.com and place a question for us, or a topic, or something like that. Or
drop a comment on Substack.
Yeah.
Whatever you feel.
All welcome.
All welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye for now.